So if you used to ask anyone in the world, is Tower Bridge in the City of London, they would be wrong. If you was to ask them about Piccadilly Circus, they would be wrong. London Eye, you got the Houses of Parliament, they'd be wrong. Surely Buckingham Palace is in the City of London. Well, no, they'd be wrong. But what happens if I asked you about St Paul's Cathedral? Then you'd be right. But what is the difference between the City of London, or better still, why is there a City of London and a City of Westminster in the boroughs of London? The UK went from a colonial superpower in the 1700s to a global financial power in the 1900s. The City of London Corporation and its banks have done tremendous damage to the world's economy since the 1950s, and that up to half of all offshore wealth globally is hidden in one of the many British offshore jurisdictions such as Gibraltar, Jersey or Bermuda, accounting for 1.4 quadrillion. With contributions from leading experts, academics, former insiders, lords, ladies, barons, campaigners for social justice and many others, the City of London Corporation and its livery companies have been around since the Romans abandoned the UK in 40 AD, leaving the city to the corporation, who expanded and fortified the city further and over many centuries to what it is today, the financial capital of the world in so many sectors and ways. The price of gold is set twice daily. The derivatives market is mainly focused here. The world's foreign exchange market, financial services, private and public bank world headquarters are situated here. Russian and Chinese companies and wealthy people place their foreign assets here away from the dollar. It's where most of the world's arms deals are made. Huge real estate, insurance, banking, and it's a fintech powerhouse. It still has an archaic top-down rotten borough system used in electing members of the city council, where all of the other boroughs in the country have eventually been abolished a long time ago. The City of London, which is not part of London or England or the United Kingdom, has its own mayor, it has its own elections, and it has its own system of governance controlled by the Common Council, which is controlled by 25% residents, 75% corporations. The City of London has its own separate mayor, city hall, its own police force, and it was created long before the creation of England, Wales, Scotland, or the UK, and it has what is called the livery companies controlling world commerce and trade, something which was built by the Romans and just abandoned in 40 AD, from which the corporation was created and has been ever since, despite there being royal families. The misconception is the City of London is part of the UK or the control lines of the Vatican, or part of the Empire of the Free States. The Vatican, DC and the city as one force was a fabrication made up by by E.C. Knuth in his 1949 book, and then was later turned into a documentary in the 1990s by Grace Powers of Armenstock Productions. Neither is the case. The city has been in competition and opposition to the Vatican ever since its creation and has evaded multiple forms of invasion through war, politics, finance, but they have always stood firm against. The Vatican, after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, with Norman victory, created the city of Westminster and took control of the monarchy in order to try to destroy or compete with the city. After multiple wars, then the Magna Carta was signed and Clause 13 separated the corporation and land from the rest of England. They then turned the world into a commons from which all resources, land and wealth was parcelled and sold off to the aristocracy, but now is being bought out by the major corporations. As for London itself, it's the main place for law firms, climate change and carbon trading companies, energy, finance. It's also where most of the ratings agencies, arms trades and exchange houses, as well as the major banks. So it's a very powerful place still to this day, unless we can destroy the tax havens where at least 1.5 quadrillion pounds, which is around about half of the world's entire wealth and assets combined, hidden within the tax havens of places like Gibraltar, Jersey, Bermuda, and in a system what is called somewhere else. They can be within the city of London, but legally they're somewhere else. This is how lots of wealthy people hide their wealth and get away with paying lots in tax. Just doing a little bit of research on the city of London and trying to get a better idea of to what it is and why it's got so many different sort of things going on there as compared to the rest of the UK, why it's got its own different legal system and what you could call a rotten borough system. And if we go through all the timelines, you can see that the Romans left in 47 AD, and then we had, as you can see here, what is called the Anglo-Heptarchy, where England was split up into 7 kingdoms run by different people. And then in 1886, Danes' Law happened, where the Danish came over and imposed their law onto the Britons, as they were called. And then Norman law, as the French or the Normans came over in 1066 with the Battle of Hastings, and then through to the Magna Carta 1215. So that's where I wanted to sort of stop there and start. In Magna Carta, the 1215 Charter of Rights between King John and the barons, not only were the rights of the whole body of the citizen respected, but the Mayor of London was designated as one of the 2 guarantors charged with ensuring that the Crown kept its side of the bargain. The City of London, which announced itself as a commune in 1191, was recognised as one of the great institutions of the ancient constitution, with a place only one step below the sovereign, so they say. The combination of wealth, functioning democratic and legal institutions, and an effective system of civic militias meant the Crown could never subordinate the City of London to its rule. London taxed itself, judged itself, and governed itself. In this way, it's the most cosmopolitan city in England, carved out of a forest by the Romans, became a custodian of the ancient liberties of the English people and the champion of common law against the state encroachment. So from sort of 1580s, when the Reformation, just after the Reformation happened with King Henry VIII, there was thousands of refugees were coming to London. Mostly they were displaced by enclosure. What enclosure was when the barons, the lords and the rich people, they shot off their lands and closed the lands so that only people within their lands can go on their lands and everyone else was blocked off. So parts of England They were not accessible, there was no road, so you were basically stuck where you were born for most of your life, if you were a peasant anyway. And by sort of 1625 it had 400,000 inhabitants, and what they did with those inhabitants is they sent them over to Ulster in Ireland. Basically the British, they went to war with the Irish chieftains, and the Irish chieftains basically lost Ulster to the British, funded, and what they did was the City of London set up the plantations in Ulster where the slaves moved over from all these refugees from around because England was enclosed, and they managed to make it to the City of London. They were all moved out to Ireland to become slaves out there. That's where the bowler hats, the Orange Orders, they always wear the bowler hats. It's all part of the City of London. And the Ulster Nationalists, completely set out by the City of London to keep this Northern Ireland, this dysfunctional carving out of Ireland. And then the Stuarts made attempts to reform London. One led to the execution of the king, the other an attempt by Charles II to establish that the monarchy was the source of the corporation's authority, and that led to the Stuarts' replacement when they brokered the William and Mary in the Glorious Revolution, which was in 1688. So Charles's second charter in 1690 leaves no doubt as to who were the greatest beneficiaries of the Glorious Revolution, i.e. the City of London. It declared that the mayor, commonalty and citizens of London shall forever, hereinafter remain, continue and be, and prescribe to be a body politic in a de facto et nomine, and shall have and enjoy all their rights, gifts, charters, grants, liberties, privileges, franchises, customs, usages, conditions, prescriptions, immunities, markets, duties, tolls, lands, tenements, estates, and hereditaments whatsoever. The money towards the new model army, which then went to war with the monarch, i.e. Charles II, and Charles II lost. The parliamentarians won. Parliament was installed, and we've had Parliament ever since. And the City of London basically paid for the Glorious Revolution, which was a fake revolution, bit like Brexit really.
The City of London was, as I think it was Edward Hyde, Charles I's advisor, the later Earl of Clarendon, says it was the head and fountain of the rebellion, and all the royalists believed this, and they weren't wrong.
Real big resistance, very strong support for Parliament. Attempt to arrest Cromwell in the city was the trigger for the Civil War. Very strong support for Parliament. They won that, and then when Parliament turned a bit restive, they brokered the William and Mary coming down. So by 1688, with the Glorious Revolution, the city is completely secure in its position within the polity. It has all its rights, assets, hereditament in this place in perpetuity forever. It's a very, very big win.
I'd like to show you a video. Someone who was in a meeting in 2005 talking about executing Brexit within the next 10 to 20 years. It's a good video. But get it back to where we were. Glorious Revolution, 1688. Oliver Cromwell. So the city was forever, had its privileges in its own place, and it's something that's never really spoken about. No one really knows about it. Even people I know that are quite sort of who have really good jobs in the banking system, they have no idea about the City of London, and I talk to them about it and they just think I'm talking shit or it's a conspiracy theory. So getting back to it, the 18th century was the glorious epoch for the city and its corporation. Conflict remained between the corporation and the crown, and this is where the City of Westminster was set up to compete with the City of London. It hasn't really competed at all. You could say it's the political hub and the financial hub of England and Great Britain, but the City of London is its own independent thing, which overshadows all the other things. So they developed things such as free trade, the free trade market, World Trade Organization came out of this, championed by the corporation. The other based on prerogative rule, and that the sovereign of the crown. The City of London, supported by George Washington and provided funds and men for the cause. The City of London reminded to the king, to the point of treason, that it was there and not he who had won the Civil War. So even as Parliament displaced the crown as the fundamental unit of sovereignty and democracy, displaced by the divine rights of king as the principle of legitimacy, the state still refused to subordinate to the Corporation of London, to national laws and practices. Its assets and its ancient privileges have always remained untouched. Now this is where the tax havens were born out of, because once Britain had secured the Atlantic, the British Empire, you could say, we set up New York, we set up Hong Kong, we had the City of London. So we basically controlled the Atlantic trade for a good 300 years, including, and we still do today in financial terms. But this is where it all came out of. The city survived each wave of Victorian municipal reform because the Victorians wanted to create London as a whole city, because London's always been a county status, it's never been a city. This is another thing that people don't know. People see London as the capital of Great Britain, but it's not. It's it's a bunch of boroughs.
In 1889, the London County Council was established. Now, very interestingly, the biggest city in the world only ever had county status. It was ruled as a county, essentially as a rural. County Hall was the centre, because it could not be recognised as a city, because there was only one city of London, and that was the square mile.
The capital city of Great Britain is Westminster. It's the city of Westminster. That is the capital city of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. But again, people think it's London because they've got this shrouded in this secrecy where half of the world's wealth is hidden. 1.5 quadrillion of 3 quadrillion, that's estimated how much the world is worth, how much money's, how much property, everything, blah blah blah. 3 quadrillion. So London as a whole was not to have city status. The county council was ruled from the county hall. The same could be said today for Greater London's authority. New Labour may have given the Bank of England its independence, but its zeal for modernisation did not extend to the City of London. They basically bolstered the City of London when Blair came in 1997, as this clip from will show you.
Remember, it was Labour Party policy from the foundation of the Labour Party that the City of London Corporation would be one of those bastions of undemocratic practice that would eradicate from local government. So it's always been Labour Party policy to abolish City of London Corporation. And I can remember doing speeches in the 1980s saying, when we get into government, this absolute aberration will go. And then during the 1990s, when Blair took over, the policy changed. And the policy changed from abolition to reform, unspecified. Then when we came into government in 97, the reform that Blair allowed the City of London Corporation to put through in its ward elections bill was not democratic reform, it was purely and simply extending the votes to more businesses. I don't know where else in the world now where there isn't at least some form of election and democratic accountability for city government. And here we have a group of people who are elected by business rather than a small number of electors. It is literally archaic.
So like you said, it's a rotten borough, and Labour's policy was to abolish the City of London, but when they actually got into power with Blair, they didn't abolish it, they gave it independence and made it even better. So we're just going back to the Civil War in London, a rebellious city. If it'll come. London remained steadfast, sending brigades into the field and eventually lending 80,000 to contract the new model army. It was the Evetts, subject to Chapter 5, that London saw parliamentarians' cause past a crucial hurdle. So this is where Parliament, the City of London, formed the new model army, and Parliament then, after, started providing all the soldiers with money and the means to fight against the royalists, and basically won the Civil War. So the last rotten borough revisited is still a rotten borough, and it was October 23rd, 1997 when the Labour extended the City of London and basically didn't get rid of the rotten borough and its undemocratic council. And 25 years later, after that decision of Matson's observation, remains that nothing's changed. Basically they haven't got rid of the boroughs. So yes, it was October 23rd, 1997 when Labour extended the rights to the City of London, and the City of London was the birthplace of British civic government, you could say. Iconic as it seems to the day, it was in the city that local democracy through ward elections was first developed, having been given royal sanction in 1191 to unify into a commune. The following year, the City of London decided to appoint their first mayor, and this was confirmed as a right by Magna Carta in 1215, like I said earlier. So they have the square mile, and they didn't want to give it up, and they probably don't want to give it up to this day. And 74% is run by corporations, and obviously the other 26% is run by residents of the city, and there isn't many residents in the city. I think there's about 30,000 people that live in their very, very high-end rich properties, of course. And the city to this day, from 1191, have had three funds: the City Fund, the City's Cash, and the Bridge House Estates. They generate money through renting out properties. They receive grants from central government, and obviously local council tax. The city's cash is an endowment fund that was built up over the last sort of 8 centuries from 1191. Its incomes are derived mainly from property, supplemented by investment earnings, and the fund is now used to finance activities mainly for the benefit of London as a whole, but of relevance nationwide, so they say, but I doubt it. The management and conservation of over 10,000 acres of open space, all of the Lord Mayor's activities, Smithfield, Billingsgate, Leadenhall markets, 3 of the highest achieving independent schools in the country, the Guildhall, all of these are paid for the city's cash and at no cost to the public. You can download the accounts page. It's quite hard to look into, but the city of the Bridge House Estates is the city corporation is the sole trustee of the Bridge House Estates, which reaches out across London in many and important diverse ways. This includes its grants, but core business of the estates for many centuries has been looking after the bridges in London. 5 other bridges across the Thames into the City of London: London Bridge, Blackfriars, Southwark, Tower Bridge, Millennium Bridge. The maintenance and replacement of these bridges remains the prime objective of the ancient charity. So that's their 3 funds that they've had. And I reckon the city's cash is a good £15 billion or something. And the city's, the properties that they own is around about 5 billion to 10 billion. And obviously the bridges, I'm sure they're worth a few bob. So we've been through the Civil War. And there was a time in sort of 1640s that they even called the City of London the third House of Parliament, and today I would even call it that. Because in Parliament now you have a guy which is called the Remembrancer, City Remembrance. This guy sits in Parliament, and he, every single day, he'll sit in Parliament and he'll be writing down what's going on in Parliament, whether laws are being changed, whether statutes are being put through. He's been seen to whisper in people's ears, to I would basically say is like a lobbyist for the City of London that sits amongst the MPs and gets to, obviously doesn't have power, but he gets to have a say. He can encourage people in other ways, and can also remind people that the City of London is there when they are considering on voting in certain ways. That's what the city's remembrancer is. So yeah, they sit in the House of Parliament. It's a very strange little thing. I think I've mentioned this before. This is where the chamber of the aldermen meet. The aldermen, they're like MPs, you could say. It's the city's version of MPs, not like Westminster. This one is from Financial Times. The City of London's strange history. It's another good read. It goes through Magna Carta, the Roman period. It even goes through Henry VIII's period. How when Henry VIII set up the Church of England, it was the city that lent in the cash to build all of the churches, or build and steal and take from the Catholic priests and monasteries, you could say. They destroyed a lot of these monasteries and rebuilt them into the Church of England. and the Church of England and the City of London have a great relationship, intertwined with each other. They both invested, set up and helped to fund the plantations in Northern Ireland as well as in America, bringing slaves across in the transatlantic slave. This also goes through that as well. It is one of the plans of one of their plantation towns. That's why they called it Londonderry. Took the name. So they had plantation towns which they built. A lot of them even had city walls. And then they moved all of these immigrants from around the UK that had gone to London over to Ulster to create what is now Northern Ireland. These people, the Ulster Unionists, believe they have a right to this land and it's their land, when in reality it's the City of London's land that they stole from Irish chieftains. 1603, the city started going into the plantations, or setting up the plantations in Ireland after they'd cleared out the chieftains, and war was still going on in the southern part of Ireland, mainly the Pale as it was called, around Dublin. Quite a good read. It's a long read if you want to download. I'm going to put all the links below of today so you can have a good look at all of these things. Even Gresham College, which is a City of London funded college, goes through slavery in the City of London. The freedom of the City of London is a status granted since 1237 to members of the guilds, the livery companies, those who are enfranchised. The word enfranchise is meant to hold the privileges of the city, a meaning which survives today in our understanding of the franchise, the right to vote, but its roots lay in two old French words, en and franchir, literally to be set free, to be released from slavery. So, in order to be a free man in the city, is you're basically freeing yourself from slavery, whereas myself, what would you call it? A British subject of the crown. No, I'm not a subject. I'm just British. Whereas someone who comes from another country, has moved here and has become a British subject and citizen, we're all slaves. Whereas a free man of the City of London, you become a free man from this, and you can never be enslaved financially, economically, in a way. Yes, that's where that came from. This is another very long read and good read about going into this slavery and the city and freeman rights. And there's a lot of statues towards slavery now in the city, because in I think it was the late 90s, early 2000s, a lot of people protested and they wanted to get rid of this image in the City of London, because it was, the whole thing was, all these nice buildings were built on the backs of slavery, so they wanted to hide that image, and so they built a lot of these places, little squares and monuments to I don't know, try and apologize in some way, or to at least get rid of the bad part of the history of slavery that the city had. today there's even still the old coffee houses, wine houses that were all over the city during slavery, because coffee and trade was a big thing, which all sort of started in Leadenhall, Cheapside. Bank of England is a big place where a lot of the records are probably still held in secret about slavery today, and they were one of the key people involved. As it says here, in 1727, the governor of the Bank of England was appointed. What does it say? Who were all sort of connected to the enslavement of Africans. The people that worked within the bank, they'd all worked on the slave routes or setting up trade routes, new ships, the sale of slaves. This was all done within the city first. Humphrey Morris was one of the most famous, apparently. So, one of the legacies of slavery is how the profits were made. It was used to enrich the cultural, natural and artistic collections. So they built museums and then went and stole all the artifacts from these countries, and a lot of them are still there today. There's countries that are asking for a lot of these things back now, and obviously museums in Britain are refusing to give them back. These are all important sort of places in the city. The Honourable Irish Society is a consortium of the livery companies. This was like the main company set up the plantations in Ulster, created in 1609, that was it. And it was incorporated in 1613 by Royal Charter of King James, so they got Royal Charter to go and take slaves from Ireland, as they did. And this was just after the 9 Years' War between Gaelic Irish chiefs and the Dublin Castle administration. The Dublin Castle administration was obviously the British of the Kingdom of Ireland. So after taking Ireland and ruling it as a sort of a whole and a body, the British then spent sort of 300 years trying to infiltrate its chieftains and the actual lands and the people within the lands, and this was where the 9 Years' War ended, and the British finally got Ulster, and that's where they set up the plantations before they set up the ones in the United States of America. Now, another subject we could touch on is the burning of Washington DC in 1814, when the British went and basically burnt the White House, Congress, anything civic, army barracks. They basically destroyed the whole city. And the reason why, I suppose, I don't know, there'll be many different histories, many different versions of why this was done. But basically the Americans, they got rid of the First Bank of America, which was still controlled by the Bank of the City of London and the Bank of England. So after the Americans got rid of the First Bank of America, it meant that the city and the British didn't have any control over America's finances. So from Canada they invaded America southwards down to DC. Apparently it took about 3 days to take over the whole of DC and parts of America, where they burnt it. And then it was around about 100 years later they installed the Federal Reserve. But my question is, so after the Americans got independence in 1776, some, 33 years later, the British then invaded. Why would it still be independent? That's my question. I don't get how it's independent when you've got the British invading, installing banks and the Federal Reserve. To me that says that they're not independent, and there was still some form of governance coming from the City of London. So the city was rebuilt after the siege, and even in the White House you can still see it was burnt. There's burn marks on parts of the windows. This was the rebuilding of all the buildings after the British had destroyed them. Capitol building. And then why would the Americans, some 100 years after this, why would they then try and help the British in World War I and World War II? You know, it's a very strange thing, I find, how the British were so bad and so evil and ruthless, and the Americans wanted to get rid of them, but then they named all their towns after British places, and then they tried to help them in a world war. And since then there's been strong economic, financial, military ties between the British and the Americans. You know, one empire can't really survive without the other. That's the way I see it. And we could probably go on and on and on about some of the things that they funded and profited from. And do they control Freemasonry? Well, I think Freemasonry and the livery companies kind of spawned out of each other at the same time, around about the same time. And a lot of people who are part of the livery companies are Freemasons, and a lot of Freemasons are in the livery companies, if you know what I mean. So that's another form of control. Now, if you're on Twitter, go check out. I'm also on Twitter, picking up daily reports on geopolitics, corruption, science, and many other things, if that's what you're interested in. But quickly, I'm just going to play you snippets from this video that I found of a guy, and this guy talks about, in 2005 there was talks going on about the city of London.
There's a reason why they're in a hurry. There's a reason for this insanity. And when he was explaining this, then he said that they have a name for this plan. This project has got a name. And I said, well, what is this name? He said it is called the Anglo-Saxon Mission. The Anglo-Saxon Mission. Now, I'd heard that before. It was something historical, I think, to do with the Crusades quite a long time ago. But I hadn't heard it in the present day context, and neither had he. And later on, as he continued to tell his story, I began to understand what I thought this might be about. Hence the title of this video, and the reason why I want to share this information with you, because we need to work together to figure out what's going on here it's extremely important to understand. There's a plan, I believe, that Hitler would be proud of, which is so evil, it's so Machiavellian, it's so hard to face up to, it's so unbelievable, that I need to put it on the table for you so that you can consider whether or not this might be a possibility. The plans that I've been describing are definitely a possibility because he heard them with his own ears in this meeting. Everything I've described up until now, up to and including a major outbreak of hostilities after the limited war. So the sequence is as follows. The planned sequence is as follows. Israel attacks Iran, then there's a ceasefire, then during which time there is heavy governmental military controls over populations in all Western countries. Then China is attacked by a biological weapon. It's a flu-like disease that spreads like wildfire. This goes all over the world, and then they have a major Third World War. And then, by this time, 50% of the population will be destroyed. And not only because of the war or the plague, but because, as many of you watching this will understand, the infrastructure goes down in situations like this. There's no food in the supermarkets, there's no gas in the pumps, the telecommunication goes down, there may not even be water coming out of the taps. People are kind of thrown back into a Victorian era without the facilities to handle this, because most people don't have their vegetable gardens, they don't have their horse and cart, they're not able to survive in the way that we used to be able to. We're very, very vulnerable in our technological advancement. We're extremely vulnerable, and of course the controllers know this. At this stage, our source was speculating about why are they in a hurry? Why do they want to do this? And there's a sort of heavy irony here, which is like, I was saying, well, if you're going to plan the Third World War, then why not take your time over it and get it right and do a really good job? You can, this could be in 20 years' time or 30 years' time, it doesn't really matter. Why is there in such a rush? And our source said that he felt, from inside information he's continued to receive, that this is still timed for something around 18 months from now. And that puts it around about the middle of 2011. He doesn't know this for sure because these events aren't calendar driven. They're actually event sequence driven. In other words, this has got to happen before that happens, and then after that the next thing can happen, then after that the next thing can happen. So a whole lot of things have got to be in place before all the dominoes fall over, so to speak. And they seem to be behind schedule in some of this. There are some planned events that definitely haven't happened. One of the things which I remembered when I was hearing this story was that our source, Henry Deacon, and many of you who've watched Project Camelot videos and read their reports for the last 3 years will know that when we met Henry Deacon in 2006, he said that in his own inside information was that there would be a war against China in 2008. Now that didn't happen. And all this time, at that time it didn't make any sense, and even now it didn't make any sense. It's like, well, all right, but why do this? Why do this? Why do this? Now, this was his answer. And our source is a pretty smart guy. He's been in the military. It's a totally different story that he didn't debrief in our audio transcript, which you have the opportunity to read, but he's had his own ET experiences in the military. He's got his own sources of information about some of the background for this. He says that he's as sure as he can be that the people who are calling the shots in the world, you can call them the Illuminati, the controllers, the cabal, whatever name you have for them, they believe that there is going to be what he called a geophysical event, a major geophysical event. He says that the best information that he's got is that the insiders believe that this is going to happen, or they are concerned that this is going to happen. And many of you watching this will know that this isn't a completely crazy idea. There have been trillions of dollars that have been spent on deep underground bases for some reason which we don't know why it is. You'll know about the seed bank in Svalbard. This is in the public domain, where all the seeds of all the plants and all the crops in the world have been buried deep inside a granite vault in northern Norway. There are many precautions being taken as if something might happen that could really threaten some of these valuable resources, including the seed banks of the world. Now, if there is going to be a geophysical event as they believe, this is because it seems to be preserved Illuminati inside knowledge, whether it's true or not, that there are repeated cyclical geophysical events about every 11,500 years. Information about what really happened to Atlantis was very probably in the Great Library of Alexandria that burnt down a couple of thousand years ago. There are persistent rumors that much of that information has been retrieved and it's in the Vatican Library. This is information which is not in the public domain and which the insiders may have access to. Whether it's accurate or not, the important thing is to realize that they probably believe that this will happen and they're making their precautions. And this might be the justification for this insanity that we've just heard about in this plan. Consider this. He said, if there's going to be a major geophysical event, something like a pulse shift, maybe it's Planet X, maybe it's some kind of energetic phenomenon that the solar system is going to be moving into, that's going to somehow destabilize the Earth or the Earth's crust in some way. We don't know. But if there were to be a major emergency like that, something that would actually make a war look very inconsequential, the thing that will help the human race to survive it, or will help parts of the human race to survive it, is if there is already emergency preparedness in place before it happens. In other words, if you knew that there was an emergency coming, if you knew, for instance, that there's a hurricane coming in to hit your city, then you put all the emergency preparedness in place beforehand. You have the troops ready, you have the infrastructure ready, you have the military ready, you have everything that you need ready to handle this situation so you can respond and react and recover in the best possible way. Our source suggests that the reason for this whole Third World War scenario is that then the Western governments, with the Chinese out of the way, will be in a state of such totalitarian control of their own population that they will be best equipped to recover and rebuild the new world after a cataclysm. And he thinks that this is what's happening. And I have to tell you that this terrible logic makes sense to me, that they would think that way. I'm not for a moment agreeing that this will happen. It's called the Anglo-Saxon mission. What that told me was that the reason for the name is because this is a white racist agenda for the inheriting of the new earth. It's a plan that Hitler would be proud of. If they think that a new earth needs to be rebuilt, a new world, think of that little phrase there, if a new world needs to be rebuilt after a cataclysm, they want the Anglo-Saxons to be doing it. They don't want the Chinese to be doing it. They get the Chinese out of the way first, and then the Anglo-Saxons will inherit this new world with the other nations, the Asian nations, the African nations, the South American nations. Presumably, it is assumed that they won't have the resources to be able to handle the situation in any kind of a way that gives them the strength to recover after whatever it is that they think is going to occur. So there are several other parts of this which also fit. And one of the reasons why this is an important presentation to make personally is my own personal thoughts, because up until now, I've been following a lot of the well-founded research on these sorts of agendas. We've had our own sources of information over the last 3 years. But I've always had questions in my mind, like, why would they do this? You know, war against China, why? Third World War, why? And suddenly, a lot of these things start to make a little bit more sense. Maybe this is what the New World Order is all about. It really is the order, the plan for the new world that they think is coming. They think this is going to happen. Now, I say again, it's very, very important to differentiate out all of this information here. I don't believe this is going to happen at all, but they might be doing something crazy to try and safeguard what they believe is their own interests. This is what we need to be aware of here. And what I want to do is I want to just state really clearly why there are profound reasons for not believing that anything like this is going to happen. There are a lot of things that haven't happened which were intended to happen. We heard a few minutes ago, I was describing how Henry Deacon described that the war against China was meant to start in 2008. That didn't happen. A lot of people thought that was crazy. A lot of people thought he was crazy. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe he heard something that was a real plan, but they're 2 years behind schedule, and maybe this will never happen at all. There are a number of other things that may have been planned and which have never transpired. It's very interesting to think about the so-called Mexican flu outbreak, the swine flu outbreak. For the last 6 to 9 months, we've been looking at a scenario where it looked as if they wanted to roll out vaccinations, they wanted a lot of people to get ill, they wanted to announce a pandemic. Even now, there have been proposals to extend this pandemic declaration for another 2 years, and nothing's happening. In England, we call it a storm in a teacup. There's nothing happening here, but maybe something was intended. Now, if it wasn't intended, it's possible that all of that could have been some kind of a test, just to see how people respond, to see how people react, to see how quickly it spreads, to see what the take-up of the vaccinations will be. And then, of course, us at Project Camelot and a number of other people who've been activists in this whole area trying to draw attention to all of this, now we're all on a database. They know who's going to stand up and start talking about all of this stuff. So it might have been an experiment, or it could have been a failed rollout of something. There's plenty of reason to believe that things are changing. This is the important thing. Where this plan originates from, it's very interesting to speculate. Our source told us that this has been in place for a long time. He'd first heard about the Anglo-Saxon mission as long ago as 1976. The Illuminati symbolism about the dawn of a new day has been going on for a long time.